Thank you. So just to start off, this is a double bill, great double bill we have today on 50 questions on faster onboarding as a QE by Ashley Graf will be our first speaker. And then following that talk, which should be about 20 minutes plus a bit of time for Q&A, we'll have Lee Hawkins' lessons learned in software testing. He'll be sharing his lessons learned, as did Bart Petticord and Kana with their book, but he'll be talking about his own lessons that have been learned through his long career in software testing. So now we're at the introduction by Sydney testers. In about 5 minutes, we'll start the 2 talks, which I've mentioned. So who are Sydney testers? Who are we? We're a group of volunteers with a focus on improving testing in Sydney. We organize monthly talks, socials, and other events for the testing community. We have a wide range of local international speakers, including Michael Bolton, Jane Spark, Zoe Tivitt, Sam Connolly, Jean-Anne Harrison, Matt Santon Rutherford. Sorry, just to add one more person in. Rich Rogers, Nikhil Nigam, Manoj Kumar. We've had a good list of great speakers over the years. If you want to get involved, we are looking for people to help out with events and help out in our committee. Speak with us or give me an email at paulwaltersau@gmail.com. So who are tonight's speakers? Ashley Graf, she's a software tester based in Sydney. She's had all her relevant experiences from a number of previous careers to each role. And she's a former marketer and she enjoys making abstract testing concepts understandable for everybody. Lee Hawkins, he's been in the IT industry since 1996, so quite a long and venerable career in both dev and testing roles. Spent most of his career helping software development teams across the world improve the way they build, test, and deliver software. Currently helps SSW and their clients to improve their testing and quality practices in his role as test practice lead. He was a co-founder of the Team Meetup group in Melbourne and co-organized the Australian Testing Day 2016 conference. Frequent speaker at international conferences and blogs on testing at Rockin' and testing all over the world. And he's a co-founder of the Epic Testability Academy, software testing training program for young adults on the autism spectrum. Fantastic. And thank you to both of our speakers who will be talking tonight. Let me stop my screen share and offer the mic to Ashley, who will be starting her talk on 50 questions to faster onboarding as a QE. Thank you so much. Please go ahead, Ashley.
It seems that I couldn't help but hark back to my darkest days as a content writer with this title. It's a title. Yeah, 50 questions. It's around 50 questions. So I suppose my topic today is onboarding, because I've done that a lot, and over my time doing that so many times, I've discovered a few tricks. And working at agency, I did a lot of onboarding onto lots and lots and lots of projects. At one stage, I think I was involved in 13 in total and 5 to 8 concurrently. So that's where I derive a lot of my experience for this talk on. And that's my introduction. So conventional wisdom holds that it takes on average 5 months to completely onboard to a professional role. However, I don't think it always has to take that long. Over the years, regardless of whether I was in-house or consulting, I noticed I always eventually asked the same type of questions when starting on a new project or at a new company. And I've had to start again quite often because I've been known to do things like document myself out of a job. Yes, that happened back in 2018. That was interesting. The logical conclusion is that asking these questions could make starting again easier. Recently, I've been working somewhere, and a few months after I joined, I decided to create a document with answers to those questions where I couldn't find them and links where I could, plus some terminal tips and tricks for tasks like closing a suspended server in my local environment just to save a tiny little bit more time. I found that two particular groups found it useful: fellow recent starters and longer timers just back from holidays. So not new, but in need of a refresher. So when I had a secondment recently, in fact, it was just last year, I decided to ask all those questions up front instead of waiting to ask when I thought I needed them. My aim was to eliminate as much as possible my assumptions, as you tend to have more unknowns than you might think. I was able to start contributing by day 3, and I was fully ready to work by day 5. Obviously, it will take longer when you're joining a whole new company and not just a new team. And this was also greenfield, which makes it a little easier than if it were a legacy project, but the concept is the same. There's a key set of information that you need to QA or just to work in a software development team, and those create the questions that you end up asking every time. So if you've heard of Michael Wilkes' The First 90 Days, this talk gives ideas for how to accelerate your learning and secure early wins as a QA. So you might be thinking as a hiring manager that this means you can go back to the rest of your hectic schedule and the QA can just ask questions. Not so fast. You still need to be ready to kick it off, and your team needs to be able to answer those questions, be willing to, and have the time to. So good culture is key, and having the time to answer those is also a question of ensuring somehow that your team is not at 100% utilization. And of course, the key to being comfortable asking questions is to be comfortable with your colleagues, and to be able to do that, you've got to get to know them so that you can remove as much as possible the feeling that you're asking silly questions. We'll get into that in the stakeholder section of people, but first let's talk about the topic of questions you would end up asking. Okay, so no, I said I was going to do that, but wait, I don't know. Okay, so there are basically 6 priorities. So there's like, first you want to get to know the people, and then once you've started doing that, then you start asking questions about the product. You get the wider context to your work. Then you start asking about your project, so you know what you're working on. And in the process of getting to know the people, you start to work on completing your access and local environment setup, but you can't really do that without step 1. And you don't really understand what's going on until you've got to step 6. But it saves time for later so that you don't leave anyone hanging. So I mentioned this process starts with the hiring manager. What do you ask them? So The first question is, what are your expectations so I can execute this role successfully? And you might think, but I've already asked it in the interview. Well, this will be a lot more detailed than what you got in the interview. And then, do you have a plan for the first 90 days? So if they have a plan, if you'll learn if they have a plan. Like if you're a sole QA or a first QA, this is particularly important, because in that position you will end up leading the strategy in some way, and you've got to know if they're even ready for that. And it'll give a context on the rest of it. So it's like a temperature check for what your new company is up to and how they are thinking. And then the third question, which doesn't really make too much sense until later, but it gives you a general picture. And then access. So I was given a great piece of advice by I was given a great method of doing things by a former manager of mine who I believe is in this call, on making access run smoothly, and that's how you use checklists. So you don't just tick it off when you get access, because maybe it's possible that it's configured incorrectly, or you're not really sure about the basics of how to use it. So if you try out tools as you go, then you can make sure that you've got the right amount of access and the basic ability to use it. And I thought that was really quite neat. And slide 5 is key people to talk to. So to help you try out your access and get your local environment set up, first ask for introductions to the newest and longest serving people in your team. The newest team member besides you has experienced the most up-to-date pains of onboarding. So ask some questions like, were there any missing or outdated steps in the README to set up the project locally? Who is the most helpful on product questions? Did you learn anything surprising about the software architecture? Can you help me set up my local development environment? Or even, who would you recommend to help me set up my local development environment? And the longest serving team member will have their productivity and company law down to a fine art. So ask some questions like, what ID is most commonly used here? How do you recommend I set that up? Why is architectural decision that doesn't seem to make sense to me? Why is product weird name? And then, can you help me set up my local development environment? So just like questions about the product and things that don't seem to make sense to you, but in like an architectural sense, whereas the newest person, you'd be asking more about how to set up, because they will still remember that. And then you might ask for a buddy, because another thing I learned that I only really started to appreciate when I joined a company where my manager had multiple direct reports, not just myself, is that you don't need to ask them all of the questions. You only need to ask them questions that rely on their level of seniority in the company. So you would ask them about the company's expectations, or what projects you'd be working on, but where to get information on those projects, that's not entirely necessary. Stakeholders. How do you learn more about the product and learn how to work with your new colleagues? So every time you get confused at stand up, write down the keywords and put together some questions and ask your hiring manager who is best placed to answer those questions. This is also more efficient than reading an org chart, which may be out of date, and you'll get the most accurate answers. In some short meetings, which you're going to set with those recommended people, you're going to ask those questions. This will be your first introduction to many stakeholders outside of stand-up working remotely. So I've created a quadrant you can see here in order of when to prioritize meeting people from left to right, top to bottom. So top left is important pretty obviously because you'll be working with them all the time. Top right is important because you can see how other teams implemented the usage of, say, certain tools within the context of your organization, or made certain decisions of how to get things done, and this can help build political capital for doing it within your own team. So knowledge and political capital, and you'll potentially also be able to get things like test data more easily, know what's in the pipeline with partners, perhaps. And I think interlaid with other teams, you'd want to initially focus on the business verticals you'd end up working with to get the product made, to like internal dependencies I saw it described, and then bottom left is important because it gives you different perspectives on how to understand the product, and also political capital for getting things done. So if you have alliances for, say, improving logging, you will have built up a stronger understanding of it along the way of building the alliance, which would have come along with your network that you would have been building. And then that makes your arguments more credible, which would eventually give the work a higher priority. Earlier on, you'll want to focus on teams like employee services, IT, help desk, ops. Later on, you'll be able to move on to teams like commercial and marketing. And bottom right is just handy to get the big picture of what's going on in the company and make friends in case you switch teams later on. So in meeting all these types of people, you pick up how they operate, how they prefer to work, so you can find the best way to work with them, so you can work that way with them. Well, personally, I've always found it easy to work with people the way they like to be worked with and try and make them work the way that I work. And then that means when I need help, it's easy to get that help. So we've talked about access and building relationships with your new colleagues, or how you might prioritize doing that. And now we're going to move on to product and project. So I kind of think you would end up asking mostly the same questions for product and project, but start off with more detail on the project while getting enough information on the product itself to be able to understand the project in its wider context. So I guess you might as well just call this everything you want a link to it, so you can at least skim through it or know what it is. And then for the project, you want to find out what project you'll initially be working on, who's the best person to talk to about that. Greenfields are already established. Where can I find customer feedback? Where can I find the user research? Anything extra that you might use to inform your testing. And the idea of asking all of this is to reduce any assumptions you might make. So like as a new starter, one of the most valuable things you can do is ask what feels like an excessive amount of questions, as more things will be ambiguous to you than to more established team members. So your role is to remove any ambiguity you might feel. And then alongside these, you might also ask, what else do I need to read? I find any company likes their acronyms, so it's nice to ask for an acronym guide. And that also tells you a lot of information. And then, of course, test data. So the test data that, like, is it possible to create all the test data internally? How easy is it to do? Does it rely on partners? And then is there anything going on in the partners test environment that could influence your test results? And that's important, so you don't report inaccurate results and cause panic and waste time, and so on. And then for the product, how did you gain domain knowledge? I think that's an important question. So at any job, you're picking up background knowledge on how that industry works to be able to answer questions. Like, so for example, I worked on a solar panel installation productivity project before. I'd done some research on how the panels are connected back when I was a marketer to market installation. So I knew that the configuration created by the bug was technically impossible, and thus I was able to report it. And I gained this knowledge by reading textbooks about the industry. You may not necessarily have to go that hard, but that's the way that they like to do it at that place. And the regulatory requirements are particularly important because it could make some processes not just highly recommended, but required. And you want to make sure that you get those things done the right way. Like, absolutely, absolutely. And so that leads us to process. So process questions are on 3 scales: company, whole team, QA team. Company, corporate training, remote work policy, perks, team member recognition. This could be a whole talk in itself that I don't particularly know much about, and it's not QA specific. So use your imagination for the rest. Start with your hiring manager and old timers for these questions. Whole team, so back to the regulatory requirements, like, are there any important processes that I need to know with regards to the product? If we're being honest with each other, the SDLC is pretty similar from one company to another, but what are the important nuances that you need to know? Is it a regulated industry, financial services, healthcare? For example, that means the company needs to have a way to follow PCI. What does that mean from a process perspective in this company? How would that influence how you test and document your work? And then all of these questions you'd ask: mailing list, chat system, meeting invitations, project management system, knowledge bank system. How do you communicate to internal and external partners? How to write tickets, how is code reviewed, process for handling production bugs, how do you do postmortems, how do you structure test plans, do you have a test case checklist, or do you still write test cases, or do you not do that either? Can I look at some bug tickets to make sure that I format it in a way that everyone can understand? How do you document your testing? How does your product team write stories? Who deploys builds to the test environments? What's the process for borrowing test devices, for using test devices? All of these types of questions are to establish your new company's specificities. And for requirements like PCI, it's not just recommended, but required that some tasks are done a certain way. Be absolutely certain that you know what they are. And then problems. So as QAs, we know that we are not just there to find bugs, we're there to identify and help solve problems on a project or even team scale, and perhaps even if that is not within your capacity, you want to know what they are, just so that you can work around them. And this is also a good opportunity to see where you can focus on adding value outside of day-to-day tasks, where to focus your 20% time or tech debt work on. And then of course, we're finally at what's the tech stack? What's your tech stack? Could you explain to me how it all fits together in the context of the project? So some of these questions may already be answered by the job description and asking about the project. This completes the picture. This also doesn't make assumptions or judgments about what types of technology they use. And then how do you do? And then internal tools. I think if we're thinking in terms of contributing value as fast as possible, I think in terms of internal tools, you would start with how to use test data tools and how to access the shared test environments. You might ask about their VPN and how to set that up if they use a VPN to hide it from prying eyes. And then you'd ask about how to create and use test data, the rules of using test data, any test environment pitfalls and issues, like does it shut down after a certain time? And then I think you could start with the key testability aspects, which I personally think are controllability and observability, and see where they've gotten to with that, which is also a potential way to contribute. And I guess that's where we come to test out your newfound knowledge. So ways that you could expand and try out what you've learned by reading and skimming all of that material and setting things up is by doing what I could only really describe as regression testing, or if you don't do that, you could just do a exploratory session by yourself, an ad hoc one where you just try out everything that you've learned. You could get involved in well, you could run the automation suite. That's another way to learn it, and also make sure you've set everything up properly. You could give feedback on business requirements which feel ambiguous. You could read about a bug experienced by many customers and try and replicate it. So a ticket can be created and it can be moved to triage and prioritization. Or you could find an internal tool to improve, get comfortable with its capabilities and limitations. And I think that's also a handy way to prove your programming abilities within the company. Although think back to the problems discussed and work on something at least medium priority. Thanks for listening. I hope this was helpful, and get set up, make friends, read a bit, try stuff out, have fun and such.
Oh, thank you so much. That was great. Appreciate it. We're going to open up for about 5 minutes of Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, please either put them in the meeting chat and I'll read them out, or unmute yourself. I do have a particular question I'd like to ask to get the ball rolling. First of all, I'd like to ask, now we live in a different era now a bit, with so many teams being online, completely online. So therefore, it's harder to build relationships when the whole team is distributed and you never meet your team in person. It's hard to build those relationships, especially if you're in a company with different silos. So as somebody who wants to manage their own onboarding process better, what have you seen? How would you approach the particular problems of or challenges, shall I say, that come around from purely online distributed teams?
Well, once I built a tiny bit of rapport with colleagues, I found what was really useful was to, before small meetings and then one-on-ones, was to have just a little small talk, basically. Kids, family, hobbies, weekends. Yeah, hobbies was a good one.
Do you mean within, say, a stand-up, or do you mean having
Oh, no,
individual chats with them?
Yeah, more like individual chats, or like arriving early for the stand-ups. You could listen to people chat and maybe join in.
Okay,
Like,
cool, thank you.
it doesn't necessarily make you friends with them at that stage, but it humanizes, I think.
Thank you. That's great. Are there any questions from the floor? Please unmute yourself if you wish. Okay, thanks. In that, I'll assume that there are no more questions at this stage. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Ashley. It's great having you. And thanks for some really interesting information in that talk. I would like to use the opportunity to introduce Lee. So Lee, thank you so much for offering to speak. Please, can you go ahead with your talk?
No worries. I'm endeavouring to share my screen. If I can get a thumbs up that you can see my slide, that would be good. All right, I assume that's sharing okay. So thanks for that kind introduction, Paul. Thanks for the chance to share a few of my lessons learned from an unexpectedly long career in software testing.
The pleasure is all ours. Trust me. It's great having you.
No worries, man. Yes, let's get into it. So I don't want to dwell too long on sort of bio-related stuff, but I'm Lee Hawkins. I'm currently the test practice lead for a consultancy called SSW. I do that part-time, and I've also got my own small consulting company called Dr. Lee Consulting. I've been in the software testing industry basically my whole career, so 20 odd years in the game. So maybe that brings some credibility along with it. I guess we'll find out. Just to be clear, this is my story, my lessons learned in software testing, or at least some of them. It's nothing to do with the book of the same name, but I do recommend that book. That's also about 20 years old, as it turns out. It's an excellent book if you haven't had the chance to benefit from the sage advice in there. I would encourage you to do so. Although it's 20 years old, I think most of the stuff is pretty much as relevant today as it was when it was written. So I'm going to talk about my story initially in lieu of a bio, really. Not going back to the dawn of creation, but thought I'd start this sort of picture with the sort of end of my academic career, if you will. So I'm originally from the UK. I did a bachelor's degree in mathematics and then did a PhD in pure mathematics. Finished up in about 1996. And you know, it turned out there wasn't a huge demand for postgraduate mathematicians within academia at that time. I'm not going to get caught up in the politics of that, but anyway, I ended up looking for a job doing something else and scored myself my first job, which was in IT as a developer for a small UK IT services company that ended up getting bought out by a rather big IT services company called IBM Global Services. I was there for about 3 years. It was an excellent introduction to the IT industry. I was working on what was then called artificial intelligence systems. They're pretty basic expert systems written in Lisp, for those that are old enough to remember that. Certainly took me through until sort of early part of 1999 when IBM decided to close down the project that I was working on, and a bunch of us were offered what they called voluntary individual separation. In other words, they would give you some money not to work there anymore. So I decided to take that opportunity. Yeah, that was a pretty good move for me. With a bit of cash in my pocket, I decided to move to the other side of the world and ended up in Melbourne. So landed in Melbourne, mid-1999. Pretty much couldn't have chosen a better time to land in Melbourne. In the IT industry, it was really a sweet spot. You know, the dot-com boom was in full flow. There were plenty of jobs around in IT, so I adopted a pretty scattergun approach to applying for jobs in the IT industry. It turned out there wasn't a huge demand for Lisp developers in Melbourne in 1999. Who knew? So I was just applying for pretty much anything. I just wanted to get my first job in Australia. And one of the first interviews I got was for a tech writing position at a company called Quest Software that I'd never heard of. You might have heard of them by virtue of their most famous product, which is called Toad. Whether you have or not, I interviewed there for a tech writer position, and at the same time they said, we're also looking for testers for this company. Would you like to interview for that? So I said, yeah, sure, I'll do that. So long story short, I didn't get the tech writing job, but I did get the testing job. So suddenly I was a senior tester, starting my sort of career in software testing. Never intending really to stay in testing. As I said, I was really just looking for my first job. So I took that and started doing testing work. It was a very traditional sort of testing environment there. There was an independent testing team with a test manager and all that good stuff. We're using something called the rational unified process. So those of you that have been around long enough to remember that will understand that I spent most of my time writing documents and not very much of my time actually doing testing. But anyway, it turns out I was actually pretty good at doing what was required of me as a senior tester. So I stuck around in that job, and after about 5 years, I even got promoted to a test lead, where I was enforcing this sort of practice of writing lots of documents and not doing very much testing. So it was really a classic process cop. Quality gates were a great thing. It was still independent testing teams. But one of the good things that came out of that particular period was that I had a chance to attend a software testing training course, which is being run at a Quest office over in Canada. I'd never heard of the course. There's something called Rapid Software Testing. So anyway, I went to Canada, did that with Michael Bolton, and really that changed everything in terms of my testing career. It's probably the only reason I stayed in testing, now I look back on it. But I came back from that course, probably very annoying to everyone, because I just wanted to change everything about the way we did testing. So it's pretty fortunate that was in 2007. By 2008, sort of by mutual agreement, we created a new position within the company called Test Architect, which was focused on sort of adopting these newer, more modern approaches to testing within the Melbourne R&D facility. So I had some fun there, sort of getting the RST-like approaches adopted through at least the Melbourne office. At that time, the company was actually bought by Dell as well, so that brought with it a whole range of joys in and of itself. So I spent about 5 years doing that. Pretty enjoyable time getting these new approaches going, to the point where that position was sort of broadened out to provide similar service to the worldwide R&D organisation. So that was pretty cool. I got to work with lots of new people across Quest offices all over the world. And it was during that time that I actually started becoming more part of the community, going to conferences and things. As I'll talk about a little bit later, I started doing conference presentations and stuff during that time. And, you know, one notable point here is during that time, I also went vegan. So same as Paul, we've got a couple of vegans on the call today. Then after about 5 years doing that in the worldwide R&D organisation, the role broadened again to this idea of software craftsmanship. So not just the testing part, but the actual way we sort of built, tested and delivered our software. So we call that software craftsmanship. So I did that for the worldwide organisation as well until mid-2020, when Quest decided that they were going to exit their Australian facility. So after 21 years, my time at Quest came to an end. So, which was pretty incredible. After, as I've said, I really took that job just as my first entry into IT in Australia, and stuck there for 21 years in those various roles across the company. And then looking back on it, as I put this together, it was sort of about 5 years in each of those different roles. And as I moved through those roles, it was really more about broadening than going deep. It was broadening responsibility, broaden the range of products, that kind of stuff, rather than going deep into anything. So that may be a lesson there, which I'll come to. So that ended in 2020, and that gave me a chance to, you know, go about doing something different. So I started my own consultancy business, and then a year or so ago, I joined SSW part-time as their test practice lead. So now I work with them to improve their internal testing practices and also work for their clients. So it's a very long sort of bio slide, but hopefully gives you an idea of what my journey has been, and the lack of intent behind my entry into testing. So I really want to talk about career development a little bit based on, you know, what I've just talked about. It's probably not a great idea to plan too far ahead, because you end up getting sort of locked into things with tunnel vision. As if you plan one or a few steps ahead, you can leave yourself open to rethinking or just seeing where the journey takes you. Now, like these two ideas that sort of seem to be competing, this equifinality and multifinality. So you've got multiple paths to the same end. If you choose a destination in terms of your career, there's probably multiple ways that you could get there. Or there's multifinality approaches that, you know, no matter where you start, you can end up doing many, many different things. So I really didn't think I'd still be in testing, or actually in testing at all. But I certainly didn't think I'd still be there 20 odd years later. Another important point in tech is that, you know, things move pretty quick. So the thing that you end up ultimately being passionate about or wanting to do might not even have been invented yet. So if you're early in your career, you know, you might end up doing something completely different from what you expect. I like this quote from Adam Grant's book, Think Again, another book that I recommend. He says, writing out a plan for your life is like driving at night in the fog. You can only see as far as your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. So saying, you know, you don't need to look too far ahead, but you can still get to your destination. So it brings me to lesson one. And that lesson, at least from my experience, is that your career is likely to evolve in unpredictable ways, and that's probably a good thing. Particularly for people early in their career, so not locking yourself in too much is probably going to be a good thing. And you can sort of go with your energy and the opportunities that come along. All right, so I've been in the game for well over 20 years. So I've seen a lot of things come. There's been a lot of changes. So Agile has come during that time. The idea of having testers embedded in dev teams has come during that time. As I said, when I started in testing, it was all about independent test teams. Don't be talking to those developer types. It was all about separation, independence. That was seen as a good thing. So we've moved towards testers being embedded in teams. We've seen these ideas like trying to automate everything, the rise of AEST. We've seen DevOps and DevSecOps and lots of other things with ops in them. CI/CD pipelines are now a thing that we're all very familiar with. Working with products in the cloud, software as a service. Of course, I have to mention AI and machine learning. Now that everyone's talking about ChatGPT, but the idea of AI being a big thing has been around for some time now. There's the idea of shifting left, shifting right, all these people shifting all over the place, testing in production, that's come along. And of course, over this time, we've got ubiquitous internet, which wasn't a thing when I started, use of mobile, Internet of Things. All these things have come within the period of my career. And there's a lot of things that have disappeared over that time as well. So record and playback automation was seen as a cool and funky thing to do when I first started. It's kind of gone away. Waterfall as an approach to software development was still very common when I started. Independent testing teams were the thing, certainly what I was part of for several years at the start of my career. Client server was the architecture of choice. I was still delivering software in physical format back then, so floppies, CDs, DVDs, pressing these things and shipping them out to customers that's the way we did things. Certainly formal scripted test cases, you'd hope they've gone away. And test managers, there doesn't seem to be many test managers around anymore. So there's been this whole bunch of things that's come along, and there's this whole bunch of stuff that's gone away. But really, there's so much that actually remains exactly the same. So at the heart of what we do, we're still trying to release good quality, useful software that solves a problem for our customers. Right? That's why they use the software. They just want to get their job done. They want to get some value from the thing that they've got from us, so that mission remains the same. And those customers still don't care about the process you used or the methodology or the tools or which of those cool new things or old things you used. They don't care about any of that. They just want software that does the job that they want to get done. And we still need skeptical, critical thinkers alongside the other people, pretty much all the other people in the team, who are focused on success, right? And confirmation bias still makes it hard for developers to doubt their own work. So the people that build the stuff are not going to be the ones that are thinking critically about how it might not work. So we still need people to do that. They might be testers. And the real challenges in building great software are still nothing to do with technology. Right, we've got, the most advanced, complicated technology we've ever had, but we still have a lot of challenges in building great software. And that challenge is not going to go away as long as humans are involved. I think humans are going to be involved for a while. So this quote from Emerson, he says, "The man who grasps principles can successfully select his own methods. The man who tries methods ignoring principles is sure to have trouble." So he's saying there that if you don't understand the sort of the fundamental foundational principles of your craft, you're likely to get yourself in trouble. So you're better off understanding the foundations and not taking so much notice of the sort of trend of the day, the methods of the day. I sort of agree with that. This next quote comes from Tara Brach. I don't know if there's anyone in this meeting who's into mindfulness and meditation and stuff. If you are, you've probably heard of her. That's also something I recommend. But this quote sort of reminds me about how to approach trends as well. So she says, you are developing the capacity to recognize when thoughts are happening without getting lost in the storyline. So this is a meditation practice. Thoughts come along, you try not to get attached to the thoughts, just let them pass. And it's not about clearing them out, but not get too attached to them. And I think that's, you know, an important parallel with trends in our business. So the lesson out of all that for me is, you know, don't latch on to trends too much, but be mindful of them. So, you know, if it's important to sort of be aware and keep yourself informed of what's going on in the industry without getting too attached or going too deep until those things become obviously more useful. Like if a trend really gets to stick, then, you know, you'll know about it already, and then you can invest some time going deeper into that particular thing. But if you try to follow every trend and go deep on all the things that come across, then, you know, you're actually going to waste a lot of time. And you're probably better off investing that time in learning the fundamentals of the craft that actually apply no matter what the trend is. Okay, so this one comes with an apology. I'm going to give two definitions in this whole talk. This is the first one. I'm sort of apologizing, but I think it's important to give these couple of definitions. Many of you will have seen this before. It's sort of the most recent definition of what testing is from James Barker and Michael Bolton. And they say that testing is the process of evaluating a product by learning about it through experiencing, exploring and experimenting, which includes to some degree questioning, study, modeling, observation, inference, etc. This is the definition of testing I've been used ever since it came out. I think it captures the spirit of what real testing is. So testing is, according to this, it's an activity, right? Testing is something we do. It's not a phase of a cycle, it's a thing that we do. And I think, you know, it's important to think about testing over tester, right? So think about the activity rather than necessarily the person that does it. And, you know, don't think of it as a phase or an artifact or something. But, you know, it's an activity that takes place throughout the development cycle. The definition also makes it clear that this is open-ended investigation, right? We're doing experiments and investigating and evaluating with the primary purpose being to gather useful information. And as such, it's a deeply human activity. Many of the things encapsulated in that definition are not things that computers are good at. They're not good at designing experiments and making judgments and evaluations and exploring and all that good stuff. So we require humans to do that. And, you know, one of the things I've learned is that the way we approach that activity of testing is, of course, influenced by changes in technology and changes in development practices. You might do different stuff in an agile practice to something else. But, you know, testing is not made redundant by any of these changes. Testing still remains an important thing to do. Okay, second definition, promise it's the last one. You might have guessed what it is. It's James and Michael's definition of checking, which they say is the process of making evaluations by applying algorithmic decision rules to specific observations of a product. It's a bit of a mouthful, but again, it's trying to make this distinction between things that are more algorithmic in nature and maybe lend themselves well to automation, and the things that, you know, we've discussed that humans are probably going to be better at, So a reality check about this, it's checking is what commonly still gets confused with testing. Well, a lot of what people think of as testing is really this checking idea, particularly those that still favour a very scripted formal approach to testing, where they want known inputs or known steps, unknown outcomes. Really, that's what is referred to as checking here. But one of the problems with that, of course, is you can only check for what you already know to check for. Since we need to know what the input is and what the output is, you can only do that if you know both of those things. So it's not very good for revealing unknowns, because we have to know the inputs and the outputs. And really, it's the unknowns that lead to risk. So checking on its own is not going to get us there. I like this little thing from Elizabeth Henriksen in her book on exploratory testing, where she says, tested means that we've checked for the known knowns, and we've also explored for the unknown risks. So of course I need to talk about automation. So it's not really about the humans or the automation. I think we benefit from having both. Automated checks are a highly valuable tactic. I'm not suggesting that they're not. They can act as awesome change detectors to work out when something's changed its behavior, whether that's what we wanted or not. So they can find bugs, particularly that change detection sort of bug, but they're unlikely to discover deep or subtle bugs that a skilled human can find, and they're not going to reveal those unknown unknowns. And so we should be using humans for where they're better than machines. Don't get too latched onto the ChatGPT hype. There's still lots of things that humans are way better than the machines at. So exploration, investigation, designing and running experiments, making judgments, and communicating information that resonates with your stakeholders. These are still key skills that humans are going to beat the machines at for the foreseeable future. So when you're thinking about test strategy, let's use the machines to do what they do best. Why wouldn't we? But let's leverage what we've got there. So they're great at repetition, and they can help us to extend and enhance our human powers. They don't replace us. We shouldn't be trying to replicate what human testers do using automation. The things that human testers do are not the things that are easily replicatable by a machine. So use the automation to help with testing that maybe can't practically be done by humans at all. For example, simulating massive loads. We often want to do like large load tests or websites or something. We've got a big event coming up. We want to make sure our ticketing website doesn't crash, although they always do. But we can use the automation to help us do that, or use the automation to help with testing that humans are just really bad at. So repeating scripted tests is one example. I know people will try to convince you that having scripted tests means that they're repeatable. They're not repeatable if they're done by humans, because humans are really terrible at following instructions exactly the same way every single time. The machines are going to be better at that. So my lesson out of all that testing, checking, automation, human testing mixed stuff is that skilled testers, human testers will not be automated away. People have been making the claim that human testing is going away pretty much ever since I started in this industry. Look up testing is dead and you'll find articles going way, way back. But it's not even something that we should be talking about, right? We should be thinking about using the humans for the stuff that they're good at, use the machines for the stuff they're good at and can help us, but not persist with this idea that we can just take the humans out of the testing picture altogether. All right, a little sort of divergence from that is this idea of having a best way to test. This has been something that sort of regularly cropped up as well during all my time in this industry. Is like, there must be one best way to test. We can sort of define this, but suppose there was such a thing, like there's a best way to do testing, what would it look like? Well, it would have to be very definitive. It would have to be very prescriptive because it's the best way, right? So you'd be able to write down what it is and describe it very, very clearly and in great detail. It might be something like a best practice or a standard, like various attempts at standardization have been made, right? And if that best way did exist in terms of a testing process, then what type of environments and choices of technology and methodologies, people, projects, tools, domains, what of all those things would it need to be perfect for? Well, if it was the best way, then it would have to be perfect for all of those factors as well. So that's a big ask if you think about it, like to come up with like a description of what testing would be that would fit all of these different contexts. It's pretty clear that that's just not possible, right? So then there is no single best way to test, just like there isn't any single best way to do development or to do management or to compose music or paint pictures or teach kids, right? There's many different approaches to all of these things that are going to depend on the situation that we're in. So it's no different with testing. There's always going to be these contextual factors that make a big difference in the way we do things. So we have had attempts to standardize our industry, for example, the AEST. I think they've done more harm than good, and they undervalue the critical importance of context. So all those factors we just talked about, they have a big impact on the way we actually go about doing testing work. So to argue that they don't seems to me a bit silly. So I think it is good to consider the different schools of thought around what makes good testing. I'm not going to tell you to use one approach over another or follow particular people over others, but there's lots of different schools of thought, different opinions out there about what makes good testing. I make no secret of the fact that I'm closely aligned myself with the context-driven school of testing. Doesn't mean you have to, but I find myself valuing the work that comes out of there, and I've had good results by adopting approaches that align with that. But there's other schools of thought, so you should do your own research there. But the key message is, so the lesson is, there isn't a best way of testing. The context is going to matter. So what works really well for you on one project might actually be a really bad thing to do on the next one. So try not to get too locked into saying this is my approach to testing, I'm going to apply that everywhere. Think more of looking for better ways of testing that leaves you open to sort of continuous improvement and applying things that make sense in the context that you're working in, rather than going for this best way or some standardized way of testing. Because there are so many different things in different projects, in different organizations, that mean we should do different things in different cases. All right, this next little section is about testing community. So obviously there is a testing community. There's many testing communities, in fact. And if you look around you in this virtual room, there's obviously other people that share some interest and passion for testing, and meetups are a great way of sort of bringing people together. But it's never been easier to connect with other testers. And it doesn't cost anything. Like these events such as this don't cost anything. There's lots of other things always going on where you can connect with other testers in sort of online communities that can help you sort of start to share your knowledge, learn from other people. It's also never been easier to share your opinion with a big audience, also for free. So there are good sides and bad sides to that. But the fact is, if you've got an opinion, you have many platforms available to you to share that opinion. So if you want to get your opinions about testing out there, you can do so for free. Yeah, it's a sign of strength to ask for help. I think this is where community can be particularly, I was going to say helpful, but obviously, and it's not a sign of strength to ask for help. So I think being involved in communities and actually getting help from other people can be a great thing, and also contributing your help to others. And sometimes it just makes sense to do things that you really don't want to do, like public speaking. I'm still not particularly sort of fond of public speaking, but I've done lots of it, and I feel like it's a worthwhile thing to do, and has helped me grow as a professional, sort of broaden my network, broaden my perspectives on a lot of things. So sometimes it's worth doing those things, and I think events like meetups and like small peer conferences and stuff are a good way to take those first steps into things like public speaking in a pretty safe environment. So specifically on my journey into testing community, in my early days as a tester, I didn't know any testers outside of the organisation that I worked in. I didn't realise any other places did it differently to the place that I worked in. So it was good to start engaging with others and realise that my own organisation wasn't the sort of be all and end all of testing. So I started talking at small testing peer conferences, one of which one of the attendees at this meetup today was actually at, and also some meetups. Ended up co-founding a meetup with another person who's on the call today. So those are the sort of small audience events that felt like a safe entry point for starting to share my opinions and experiences about testing. I joined Twitter and started blogging pretty much at the same time after attending some peer conferences. Twitter was the place back then where testers seemed to be congregating to share their testing wisdom. I'm not sure that's still the case, but that's where I started, and also started blogging. It was out of one of these sort of small peer conference environments that I was encouraged to sort of take one of the stories from one of those peer conference talks to a wider audience at a conference. That was a suggestion by a person that's turned into a mentor of mine, a guy called Rob Saberin. And that led to my first conference talk, which was at the Let's Test conference in Sweden back in 2014. And since then, I've done lots of conference talks all over the place, but had some fun times there and got to visit some interesting places like Estonia and Vietnam that maybe I wouldn't have done without actually the opportunity to talk at conferences. So we're sort of taking that first initial step, I guess, in those smaller environments, and then building up to bigger events as I got going. Another key thing in my journey has been the Association for Software Testing. If you haven't heard of them, go and take a look. Not-for-profit testing organisation. I've become pretty active there, helped to organise their Melbourne testing conferences. I also started some sort of testing projects outside of what I was directly working on in my employment. So one of those was the Epic Testability Academy, which was a free software testing training course for young adults with autism. That was a joint effort with Paul Seaman, who I believe is on the call tonight. That was a great experience for both of us. I think we both took a lot away from that. I've also written a couple of books. An Exploration of Testers is my ebook. You can find that on LeanPub. And I actually donate all of the proceeds from that book to the Association for Software Testing that has a grant program to run meetups. So I'm really keen on that sort of grassroots testing community. So I donate the proceeds from that to help them fund meetups, and more recently another book for the Association for Software Testing called Navigating the World as a Context-Driven Tester, which is a crowdsourced ebook, which is free. So you can find that on their website. So you may think, that all sounds like a lot of work. So a lot of the things I've talked about are things outside of what I was doing for my job. So why would you bother? Well, I mean, you're all here probably outside of your work time now, so why bother? I think it's worth remembering that whatever your experience level is, sharing that experience and your opinions about testing is likely to help someone. You might think everyone already knows this thing, or you haven't got enough experience to talk about this thing, but sharing in your unique way might genuinely help someone else. So I think the idea of sort of giving back is really important. By doing that, you also sharpen your own understanding of things. If you really want to make sure you understand a topic, commit to giving a talk on it somewhere, and then you'll really make sure you understand it before you talk about it. Broadens your perspective, as I've talked about, because you start to learn the way other people do things in their organization, not just your own one. And it's also a really good thing for mental health, like belonging to a good, safe community, particularly in these times where so many people are still working from home, maybe not having that social connection with their office mates anymore. I think being part of a community, or finding your little testing tribe, wherever it might be, there's lots of communities around within our industry. Like being part of one of those and being active, it is likely to be a good thing for your mental health. So it was a very long-winded way of coming to the lesson, which is you should become active within the testing community. So my final lesson is about change. So I've talked about a lot about like things that have come during my time and things that have gone, and lots of stuff's actually stayed the same. So if you are required to sort of try to change the way things are done in your organization, or get people to change their opinion on something, just note that humans are hardwired to resist change. So you've got a tough task ahead of you. And trying to change the way people think about testing, or indeed anything else, it is not an easy thing to do. So I'm sure our host today will be very familiar with these problems, but I'm an ethical vegan, and trying to convince people that going vegan is a good idea for their health and for the environment, and obviously for the animals. You'd think it'd be an easy sell, but it's actually a very tough thing to convince people of. And it turns out that facts and evidence and statistics and stuff are just not enough on their own. You can throw all of this factual stuff at people and it just bounces off, right? It's not going to get through in a way that actually changes their behavior. So another quote from Adam Grant in his Think Again book, he says, "When we're trying to open other people's minds, we can frequently accomplish more by listening than by talking. Increase your question to statement ratio." So he's really saying here that by listening more, you have the chance to understand the other person's perspective, and you're listening to understand them and to understand that perspective, not just to respond to them and bounce back with a fact and a statement. And that doesn't really help you. So asking lots of questions, sort of more like a Socratic method, can help you to really engage and understand the other side of the story. So I've certainly fallen into the trap in my career of, bombarding people with facts and new processes and stuff, because that was going to change everything about the way things got done. But that's generally not very successful. So a few things I've learned along the way, like you can be the biggest expert in software testing you like, but if you can't get that message across about why it's important to change something, then it really doesn't matter how much you know about the topic. So you do well to learn some psychology as well as testing. So learn about how people think, and then you've got a chance of sort of making your point. Focus on stories and examples over facts. Humans, again, hardwired storytelling. This is the way that stuff's got passed down through generations, is through story. So instead of just a laundry list of facts, try to sort of weave some compelling narrative that can help you to make your points. If you are trying to make some points, you've got this great list of points about why someone should do this new thing, just focus on a few of the points, not all of them, and just a few of the strongest ones. If you present your full list of points, people are going to pick on the weakest ones to make an excuse for why they shouldn't change anything. So just pick the strongest points and just a few of them, and just start there. Include a space between stimulus and response. If you haven't heard of Daniel Kahneman, I'd encourage you to have a read of his book called Thinking Fast and Slow. So the idea here is that, again, there's a lot of brain wiring here that means we can react to stuff really quickly without really thinking very deeply about what that reaction is. So if we deliberately put a pause between when something happens and the way we respond to that thing, then we can include some deeper thinking. This can be useful in talking to people about change. So you listen more to understand, take some time before you actually respond back to them. Resisting the urge to go into solutioning. If you're solutioning all the time, then the people that you're trying to influence and help are not going to improve for themselves, because you're always providing solutions. So asking questions rather than jumping in with solutions can be helpful. And just give people some quick wins. Like if you're trying to get some change happening, make sure there's some small changes they can make where they actually see that change works. Makes them feel better, builds some credibility for you. So quick wins are a nice little thing to do to make everyone feel better about the change. So that's my final lesson. Changing mindsets is not easy, including your own. So just be aware that you've got some of that to fix as well. All right, so 6 lessons there. I didn't want to share my entire life story here, so these are just 6 of the things that I thought might be of interest to a general testing audience. So just to review those. So your career is likely to evolve in unpredictable ways. Don't worry about it. It's all good. Don't follow trends too much. Just be mindful of them. Be aware of what's going on in your industry, but don't get too attached to things. If they become important, then you can dive deeper once they become important. Testing is not dead. Skilled testers are not going to be automated away. There's no single best way of testing. Context matters. So don't try to find this one sort of approach that you try to replicate everywhere that you do stuff. You should be looking for better ways of doing the testing for a particular context that you're in. I would encourage you to become part of the testing community and get active. You're in a meetup right now. Well done for doing that. Maybe you can talk at the next one. And changing mindsets is not easy. It's, as Jerry Weinberg said, it's always a people problem. So maybe some of the little tips and tricks I've provided for that might help you, but that's not an easy journey. Okay, so thanks for listening. Again, thanks to Paul for the opportunity to have a chat tonight. Here are some ways you can find the work that I do, links to my books and blog and Twitter and all that good stuff. I have just released a new software testing training course, actually just last weekend, again with my mentor Rob Sovereign. So check that out. It's you'll find it on the Test Tribe. But with that, I better wrap up after 45 minutes. So thanks for listening, and I'm open to any questions if we've still got time, Paul.
Well, thank you. We do still have time. Thank you so much. That was a really good talk, and yeah, I think everyone can get some value from that. I think that, you know,
Cool.
I learned a lot. I also reminisced a lot, actually, because I've been in testing for, well, since, you know, the late 2000s, and so I've seen a lot of the things that, you know, you mentioned in terms of the things that were passing fads, the things that you know, came about in that time, and things that disappeared.
Mm.
I would like to obviously open the floor to questions. You've got two ways of doing it. You can either post in the meeting chat and I'll read the question out, or you can just unmute yourself. And as long as you're not interrupting anyone else, you know, just pose your question. So are there any questions from the floor? Actually, while people are thinking of questions, I think I might pose a question, if that's all right.
Sure.
I want to say, one of the things that you mentioned is about community, you know, obviously trying to get involved in the testing community. And while things like meetups can be, you know, are quite fun, and we do try to be accommodating, I do know from experiences that people have mentioned to me that if you're from a place that has a very old style, or very, can I say, you know, like we used to call the factory method type of testing, where it's, you know, it's a lot of scripted tests, or you're working for a consultancy, which is, you know, you do a lot of scripted testing. It's a lot of manual testing. There's not, it does seem, it can be intimidating to go to a meetup or to express your views online if you think that they're not the most recent, sorry, they're not the most up-to-date views, or they're kind of seen as old-fashioned. How could you encourage people, you know, from a, say, a big consulting background where it's bums on seats and there's lots of people and they're doing lots of manual scripted tests, say, to get involved in you know, to get involved in the community? How can you make it more open for them?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like I said, I think there's different. Like, there's not just one testing community, right? There's different spots here. So something like the AEST community, for example, is probably not the place for them. Like that's more of a, for people who are looking to like advance the craft at a higher level, I guess. And then you've got things like the Ministry of Testing community, for example. I see a lot of stuff on there that is that really is from folks that are maybe either early in their career or sort of stuck in a particular way of doing things, and that seems to be a pretty safe place for people to talk about that stuff. And I guess it's you know, it's contingent on all of us that are involved in community not to sort of belittle people who make the effort to step into different communities that happen to think differently to us. You know, and you know, I think this meetup is doing a good job of that. I don't think anyone would be shot down for having.
No, we certainly wouldn't shoot anyone down for that. But thank you for the question. I appreciate it. I think on just to say very quickly on that side, then I'll move on to Christina's question. That I think there is a point that, you know, if we follow a contextual model, there are places where everything can work. There are particular scenarios where sometimes, you know, maybe highly structured, regulated environments where, you know, sitting down and doing lots and lots of scripted tests that conform to a particular standard that's been enforced on you is the right way to do things. In that particular niche. And, you know, it's not the most effective way of testing, but there are times where you have to do it like that. You know, I worked for a consultancy and we did exactly that for years, you know, and I think it can be, and so therefore there is always a, you know, there is always a place, you know, people from every testing background should always be accommodated at meetups. Can I move on to a few questions? Is that all right?
Certainly. Yeah, sure.
Christina Sipos has asked, hello, I'm a fresher in testing. I made a software testing course. I am not yet working as a tester. I assume she's doing a course at the moment. I'd like to know how to build a portfolio. So if you wanted to do a testing portfolio to get you set, you know, help your employability, what do you recommend, Lee?
Great question. That's it's an interesting topic because, you know, there's a lot of careers where building a portfolio is just a normal thing to do. Like if you're a designer or you're some kind of visual artist type person, that's what they do, right? here's my portfolio. This is the great stuff I've done. Whereas a lot of the stuff we do in IT generally is a bit more nebulous, right? So I think in testing you could, you could start to contribute actual testing activity to an open source project, for example. Most open source projects are always looking for testers, so you could demonstrate through some of your GitHub contributions and open source. So you've done some testing there. You could start a blog and start writing about testing, so at least people can see what your opinions are about it. So then there's ways you can do it. I think a lot of people are using LinkedIn to sort of build a portfolio these days. They're posting stuff and a variable quality, it has to be said, but if you've got something useful to say, it's maybe worth posting there, because a lot of recruitment seems to be via your LinkedIn profile these days and the kind of stuff you've been communicating there. So maybe do it through something like LinkedIn or a blog. I think would be a good place to start.
I think, thanks. That's some great stuff, I have to say. I think, if I can just chip in with a few thoughts. Yeah, open source is a very good way of getting involved. And also, I think that contributing to the discussions that you have on LinkedIn groups can be quite good, or trying to, or making, or just talking about the testing that you're doing on LinkedIn. And putting the right hashtags in so people can see it, and then you can use that to build connections. Getting involved in those testing conversations that we have online. Yeah, some of them are good and some of them are terrible, as you said, Lee. I think we've all seen some of the worst, some of the terrible ones you see on LinkedIn now and again. But I think it's probably worth saying that sometimes that's not, it doesn't impress all recruiters. I know there are recruiters who, I know this when I was looking for work in 2021, and they only care about practical experience at work. They don't care about things you do in open source. For them, only work you do, so only experience you gain in a commercial capacity matters to them. And that is unfortunate. And there will be some jobs you can't get, but it's always worth looking at it. And the same thing it's the same case for dev as well. Like there are some developers who will never be able, there are some recruiters who don't look at open source projects at all for dev. So, but most do, and you just have to find the right ones. You only need one job. You don't need tons. Just to say, Christina also asked, what's your advice for a fresher generally? Is there anything more you can add in terms of what a new person might do?
Well, it probably is worth doing some training if you are keen on this sort of stuff. But again, be careful about what you choose there. Like it's my personal opinion that watching the AEST sort of syllabus isn't that value, even as a fresher. I know it's what they pitch to, but I'd much rather you learn stuff that sort of helps you think about testing rather than just about learning terminology in testing, which is never consistent from one organization to another anyway. So I think that's potentially more confusing than anything. It's someone pointed out there, Ashley talked about some good questions that you can ask, right? So that's important when you're a fresher. And not just to plug the latest work I've done, but the software testing course I've compiled with Rob Sabrin is specifically designed for testers with 0 to 5 years of experience. So that might be a place to look to.
That's cool. Thank you. Are there any other questions? If you have any questions, please unmic yourself or ask in the meeting chat. Okay, I'm just saying there's no questions at the moment, but I would like to ask another one if that's all right.
Sure.
So regarding, we were talking, you mentioned before about old ways of standardizing testing, things like the AEST you mentioned before, which is as much about, I don't have a great view of the AEST myself, to be honest. So I think that at one time there was a lot of the community was focused on fighting back against efforts to standardize things. I remember IE 829 about test documentation. That was, people trying to impose test documentation standards top down, and in doing so, imposing a testing standard. Things like IE 291, ISO 29119, etc. In a sense, the testing community spoke in one voice at the time to push back against that, and none of those standards have done. I mean, nobody talks about them today.
No.
So in that respect, do you think that the more context-driven approach, or the the less sort of top-down, very structured approach, do you think that the context-driven approach, or the way of using common sense and flexibility within an agile, do you think that's won the day, or are there still efforts to try and standardize testing in a way that might be deleterious to what we do?
That's a very it depends answer, I think. But I sort of had great hope when agile sort of became a thing, that by necessity people would adopt testing approaches that weren't as rigid or as formalized or required all this sort of guff that they used to use, just out of time pressure as much as anything else. But I don't think it's completely gone away. There's, I trawl the job ads on Seek every now and again just to see what's going on. And so many ads still ask the people whose job it is to write test cases and execute them at the same time as they claim to be, Scrum environments or something. So, it feels like part of the way we develop stuff has kind of moved on into these more flexible ways of doing stuff, but the testing approach seems to kind of be stuck in a lot of places into pretty much the way it was 20 years ago, unfortunately, which is sad to see. I think in a lot of places it has moved on a long way, but that movement has kind of gone almost too far the other way in a lot of places, to the point where you do get this let's automate everything, we don't need human testers at all, continuous deployment thing. So there's no room anymore to have any testers embedded in that process. So it's a real mixed bag, I think.
I must admit, I think there have been people, I think Michael Bolton was called that sort of that sort of very tight continuous integration, automate everything approach, an anti-pattern. And I think there's some truth to the fact that where I work, we still rely so much on investigation and people actually looking at the product. We try and incorporate it at every stage. I'm not a, automation has its uses, but we should never overestimate what they are.
Yes, I think there's been a lot of overestimation in that area.
Indeed,
for various reasons, but and particularly with these sort of more recent pushes towards, we just want to go straight from the developer changing a line of code to being in production without any humans in between. Now I see that as an anti-pattern personally, but that's becoming a contrarian opinion.
Yeah. So I think that just any more questions? Okay, well, we'll wrap it up there then. Cool. It's been on for about nearly 2 hours, but I just wanted to thank Lee and thank Ashley so much for their talks and for their time and for their insight and knowledge. We can all learn something from them, and I just want to give you all a round of applause. Yeah, and thanks to you for putting on, Paul. Good stuff. It doesn't quite work online, I'm afraid, but, unless everyone unmutes and gives you a round of applause, but hopefully you... Zoe, and so we've had some very nice messages, actually. I should read them out. Tripty gives it's clapped her hands. Thank you so much. So we've had some nice, please allow me to read these out for a few seconds. Joe Parrell says, thank you for the talk, Ashley, and for the information you provided. Yep, thank you for that. Great stuff. Richard Robinson, who he's dropped the call, but he was actually the lead, he was actually the chair of Sydney Testers when I'd first joined, and I ended up replacing him as chair. Well, actually, Sam Connolly did, and I worked with her for quite a while. But very good. Thank you, Lee and Ashley. It's nice to hear content that's familiar and I agree with. Tripti Shrestha, I'm sorry if I got your name wrong, says, thank you, Ashley and Lee, for sharing your experience.
You're welcome.
Zoe says, she's dropped off the call as well. Thank you so much, Paul, Ashley, and especially Lee, for sharing your experience and information tonight. Christina Sipos says, thank you. So really, thank you so much. I just want to tell everyone who's remaining on the call that this is being recorded. We will post it on YouTube within the next week. I sometimes have to go through and correct some audio problems. That's the only delay. And then I will post that in the meetup as to when it's ready, so that everyone can share the benefits of this talk. The of the two talks, yours and Ashley's. I also want to say that we will be having an in-person event next month, but I'm just determining the dates of that and the speakers, so I will be announcing that shortly. There is a we are supporting sorry, my mind has gone blank for a second. I'll tell you in a second.
We're going to say
we are supporting test. Yeah, I've got the name of it for a second. I'm speaking of it, crying out loud. I've got the name. I was just chatting with Cameron actually. Yeah, we are supporting Testing Talks conference in Sydney on July the 26th. So if you're able to come to that, it should be a great event. I went to, we both did. Lee and I were both at the one in Melbourne, and we really enjoyed it. Yep. So there's a meetup for that as well, but you have to register and get a ticket, purchase a ticket on at testingtalks.com.au. So I just want to thank you so much for attending, for speaking, and thanks everyone for attending. Ashley, I just want to wish you, to say thank you to you and wish you a good night as well. And Lee, thank you so much. Have a great night, and hope to, and please keep in touch, and both of you, and and hope to hear from you soon. Hope to see you at the next event, everyone.
Sounds good. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool.
Thanks,
Sorry,
everyone.
Ashley. You were saying? Oh, sorry. I thought you were saying something. No, folks.
So yeah.
Take care. See you. Have a great night. Appreciate it. Thank you.